A camera was found in the basement of a hardware store in Kingsport, Tennessee, covered in dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. Inside were photographs that shouldn't exist, showing places that hadn't been built yet, people who hadn't been born, moments that belonged to years still waiting to happen. The date stamped on the back of each photo was always the same, a year that had already passed, but the images themselves told a different story entirely. What the finder discovered would challenge everything anyone thought they understood about time, memory, and the fabric of small-town American life. Subscribe now, because some American mysteries are too strange to miss, and this story will change how you see the past. The hardware store sat on Main Street in Kingsport for over 80 years, a relic of post-war Tennessee, where locals bought nails and paint and exchanged news. It closed down without ceremony, the owner simply locking the door one evening and never returning, leaving behind shelves of inventory and decades of accumulated clutter. When the new owner took possession, cleaning out the basement to convert the space into storage, she found boxes stacked in corners that looked untouched since the building was constructed. Among them was a leather camera case, cracked and stiff, holding a Kodak Brownie that hadn't seen light in what appeared to be half a century. The camera still had film inside, undeveloped, waiting in the darkness like a secret that refused to die. She brought it to a specialist in Johnson City who still processed old film stock, curious about what memories might emerge from the chemical bath. The first photograph showed the parking lot behind the hardware store, but instead of gravel and weeds, it was paved with fresh asphalt and painted lines. Cars in the image were models from the early 2000s, sleek and modern, nothing like the vehicles that would have existed when the camera was manufactured. In the corner of the frame stood a cell tower, its metal lattice rising against a clear sky, technology that wouldn't arrive in rural Tennessee for decades after the camera was made. The date stamped on the photo's back read 1953, but everything in the image belonged to a world 50 years beyond that moment. The specialist stared at the print for several minutes before calling the woman back, his voice uncertain, asking if this was some kind of test or experiment. She had no explanation, only the growing sense that something impossible had been locked in that basement, waiting for someone to finally look. The second photo was even stranger, showing the interior of what appeared to be a restaurant that had never existed on Main Street during the 50s. Customers sat at tables with laptops open, their faces illuminated by screens, dressed in clothing styles from the late 90s and early 2000s. Behind them, a flat-screen television mounted on the wall displayed a news broadcast, the graphics and text design belonging to modern cable networks. Every detail was crisp and clear, no signs of manipulation or double exposure, just an ordinary scene from an era that hadn't yet arrived. The woman who found the camera began asking around town, showing the photos to longtime residents, but no one recognized the restaurant or could explain the anachronisms. One elderly man looked at the image for a long time before saying the layout matched a building that burned down in 47, 6 years before the photo was supposedly taken. She continued developing the role, each image adding another layer of impossibility to a mystery that seemed designed to defy rational explanation. A photo of children playing in a park showed equipment made of bright plastic, the kind of safety-conscious playground structures that didn't exist until regulations changed in the 80s. Another captured a street festival with banners advertising businesses that wouldn't open in Kingsport until the 21st century, their logos and fonts unmistakably modern. In one particularly unsettling image, a woman stood on a corner waiting to cross the street, her face turned slightly toward the camera, wearing sunglasses with a design that wouldn't be manufactured for another 40 years. The woman's posture, the way she held her purse, everything about the moment felt genuine and unstaged, as if someone had simply documented an ordinary afternoon in the future. The finder began to wonder if she was looking at evidence of something beyond conventional understanding, a tear in the normal progression of time itself. But that was only the beginning of what the camera would reveal. Local historians became involved when news of the photograph spread through the small community of researchers and enthusiasts who studied East Tennessee's past. They examined the images with magnifying glasses and digital scans, searching for any sign of forgery or artificial construction, but found none of the telltale markers. The film stock itself was analyzed and confirmed to be manufactured in the early 1950s, the chemical composition matching exactly what would have been available during that period. The camera showed no modifications, no way it could have been loaded with more recent film. or used to create composite images through multiple exposures. Everything about the physical evidence suggested the photographs were exactly what they appeared to be: genuine images captured on period-appropriate film in a camera from the past. Yet the content of those images remained stubbornly impossible, showing a version of Kingsport that wouldn't exist for decades after the shutter clicked. One researcher noticed something peculiar about the shadows in several photographs, the angles suggesting they were all taken during the same time of day. The sun's position indicated late afternoon in autumn, probably October based on the quality of light and the length of shadows cast across pavement and grass. When he cross-referenced this with historical weather data for Kingsport, he found that October 1953 had been unusually clear and mild, perfect conditions for photography. But this only deepened the mystery, confirming that if the photos were somehow genuine, they captured future scenes under lighting conditions that matched the date stamped on their backs. The woman who discovered the camera began researching the hardware store's original owner, trying to find any connection to photography or technology that might explain his possession of such an artifact. What she found instead was a man who had lived an unremarkable life, a veteran who returned from the Pacific, opened a business, and died quietly in his sleep at 73. Among the remaining photos on the roll was an image that made everyone stop and reconsider their theories about hoaxes or experimental art projects. It showed a memorial plaque mounted on a brick wall downtown, dedicating a small plaza to victims of a factory fire that killed 11 workers. The plaque's inscription included names, a date in April of 2001, and a quote about remembering those lost to tragedy and preventing future harm. Researchers verified that such a fire had indeed occurred in Kingsport, on the exact date mentioned, claiming exactly 11 lives in a textile factory near the river. The memorial had been installed 2 years after the fire, its design and wording matching perfectly what appeared in the photographs supposedly taken in 1953. There was no way anyone in the 50s could have known the specific names of victims, the exact date, or the precise wording chosen by a memorial committee that wouldn't convene for another half-century. The finder sat alone one evening with the photographs spread across her kitchen table, trying to construct any theory that might encompass the evidence before her. Time travel seemed absurd, yet here were images that demanded exactly that explanation, or something equally impossible that simply lacked a convenient name. She thought about the hardware store owner, imagining him in his basement with this camera, somehow seeing through decades into moments that hadn't yet crystallized into reality. Had he understood what he possessed? Or had he simply taken the photos and put the camera away, disturbed by what developed in his darkroom, unable to share the discovery? There were no notes, no diary entries, nothing in the estate records that suggested he'd ever spoken about the camera or its impossible contents. Just silence, and a leather case hidden in a corner, waiting for someone else to find and struggle with the same unanswerable questions. Make sure to subscribe because the truth behind this mystery goes deeper than you can imagine, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Another photo showed what appeared to be a graduation ceremony at a local high school, students in caps and gowns arranged in rows on bleachers. The architecture of the building behind them matched the current high school, but that structure hadn't been built until 1978, replacing an older campus. Several of the graduates' faces were clear enough to identify, and when shown to longtime residents, 3 were recognized as people who did indeed graduate from Kingsport High School. But they graduated in 1992, nearly 40 years after the photo was supposedly taken, their young faces exactly matching how they'd looked on that distant spring day. One of those graduates was now in her 50s, working as a nurse in Johnson City, and when approached with the photograph, she sat down heavily and said nothing for several minutes. Finally, she confirmed it was definitely her, wearing the same dress she'd chosen for graduation, standing in the exact spot she remembered captured by a camera that shouldn't have existed. The question became not whether the photos were real, but what mechanism could possibly allow a camera in the 1950s to capture images from decades into the future. Some suggested quantum entanglement. Others proposed theories about temporal loops or parallel dimensions intersecting at specific geographic coordinates in East Tennessee. A few pointed to the region's complex geology, the way fault lines and underground caverns created unusual electromagnetic signatures that occasionally affected electronic equipment, but none of these explanations addressed the fundamental problem. This was analog film, chemistry, and light. not digital data that might somehow be corrupted or manipulated by strange physics. The camera had simply recorded what was in front of it, except what was in front of it hadn't happened yet, wouldn't happen for years or decades after the shutter closed. The finder began to wonder if she was asking the wrong question, if perhaps the mystery wasn't about the camera at all but about Kingsport itself. She started researching the town's history more deeply, looking for anything unusual, any events or characteristics that might set this place apart from other small Tennessee communities. Kingsport was planned as a model city in the early 20th century, designed by urban planners with specific ideas about efficient layout and industrial development. The streets followed geometric patterns that struck some as almost too precise, too calculated, as if the town itself was an experiment in controlled growth. During World War II, the area hosted chemical plants producing materials for the war effort, some of which remained classified for decades after the conflict ended. There were also persistent local legends about strange lights seen in the hills at night, sounds that didn't match any known animal, moments when compasses would spin without reason. Nothing conclusive, just a collection of oddities that might mean everything or nothing, depending on how desperately one needed an explanation for the impossible. One photograph showed a parking lot filled with cars during what appeared to be some kind of public event, banners visible in the background advertising a fall festival. The vehicles were all from the early 2000s, their makes and models easily identifiable, and several license plates were clear enough to read partial numbers. A retired police officer who saw the image recognized the location as the community center parking lot, and remembered that specific festival from October 2003. He even recalled the weather that day, unseasonably warm, and pointed out a pickup truck in the photo that had belonged to his neighbor, distinctive because of custom running boards. The detail was overwhelming, too specific and too accurate to be coincidence or lucky guessing, too mundane to be anything but genuine documentation of an actual moment. Yet the film stock was definitely from the 1950s, and the camera had definitely been locked in that basement since at least the 70s, based on dust accumulation and box arrangement. The finder contacted a physicist at a nearby university, hoping that someone with training in temporal mechanics might offer insights beyond speculation and folklore. He examined the photographs with professional skepticism, running tests on the paper and checking for chemical signatures that might indicate modern printing, disguised as vintage processing. Every test confirmed the images were developed from genuine 1950s film stock using period-appropriate chemicals, the kind of processing that left distinct markers impossible to fake convincingly. The physicist sat back in his chair and admitted he had no framework for explaining the evidence, no theory that could account for analog precognition captured on chemical film. He suggested half-seriously that perhaps the camera hadn't photographed the future, but rather someone in the future had somehow impressed these images onto film in the past. The idea made no more sense than any other explanation, but it at least acknowledged that conventional physics had no tools for addressing what lay spread across his desk. The next photo in the sequence showed the interior of what appeared to be a coffee shop, people sitting with laptops and smartphones, a scene completely ordinary except for when it was supposedly captured. Behind the counter, a menu board advertised drinks with names that wouldn't enter American vocabulary until Starbucks popularized coffee culture in the 90s and beyond. The finder recognized the space as a building that had been a dry goods store in the 50s, then empty for years, before being renovated into a cafe around 2006. She knew this because she'd attended the grand opening, impressed by how they'd preserved some original architectural details while modernizing the interior completely. The photograph showed that same interior, the same careful blend of old and new, captured supposedly half a century before anyone had conceived of putting a coffee shop in that location. It was as if the camera could see not just forward in time, but specifically to moments of particular significance or transformation within the community. But the truth was only beginning to emerge from the remaining images on that impossible roll of film. 3 photographs near the end of the roll showed the same intersection downtown, but each captured it in a different era, based on the vehicles and storefronts visible. The first showed the intersection as it appeared in the 1970s, based on car models and the presence of a gas station that operated only during that decade. The second jumped forward to the mid-90s, the gas station replaced by a convenience store, newer traffic lights, different signage on buildings across the street. The third showed the intersection as it looked in the early 2010s, updated pedestrian crossings, LED streetlights, a bank branch that opened in 2009. 3 different moments in time, all captured on the same roll of film, all supposedly taken with the same camera on the same day in 1953. The progression suggested whoever used the camera wasn't randomly photographing the future, but deliberately documenting how Kingsport would change across the decades to come. The finder started having trouble sleeping, her mind circling the mystery without finding any purchase, any solid ground from which to build an understanding. She would wake at 3 in the morning thinking about the hardware store owner, imagining him standing on Main Street with this camera, seeing through time itself. Had it frightened him? Or had he felt chosen, blessed with knowledge that transcended normal human experience of sequential moments and linear progression? The fact that he'd hidden the camera suggested fear, or at least a decision that such knowledge was too dangerous or disturbing to share with others. Perhaps he'd taken the photos as a test, trying to understand what he was seeing, and then put the camera away when the developed images confirmed his impossible observations. She wondered if he'd ever been tempted to try again, to load new film and see what other futures might crystallize in his viewfinder, or if once was enough to convince him some doors should remain closed. One photograph showed a memorial service in the town cemetery, people gathered around a fresh grave under a gray sky that threatened rain but held back. The clothing style suggested sometime in the early 2000s, and several faces in the crowd were clear enough that researchers began trying to identify the attendees. After weeks of careful inquiry, they determined the service was for a local teacher who died in a car accident in December of 2004, a tragedy that shook the small community. Several people in the photograph were identified by family members as having definitely attended that funeral, wearing the exact outfits they remembered choosing that cold morning. The grave marker visible in the background matched what was eventually placed at the site, including a specific quote the family selected after days of difficult deliberation. Once again, the level of accurate detail overwhelmed any possibility of fabrication or lucky coincidence, leaving only the impossible conclusion that the camera had witnessed an event decades before it occurred. The finder began to notice something else about the photographs, a pattern in what was chosen to be documented and what was left unrecorded. There were no disasters, no accidents, no moments of violence or acute suffering captured on the roll, despite the fact that such events certainly occurred in Kingsport's future. Instead, the images focused on ordinary transitions, community gatherings, the slow evolution of buildings and streets, the kinds of changes that marked time's passage without dramatic rupture. It was as if whoever took the photos wanted to document continuity rather than catastrophe, to see how the town endured and adapted rather than how it might be shattered. This suggested intention, consciousness, a directing intelligence that chose what future moments deserved to be pulled back into the past and preserved on film. The hardware store owner, if he was indeed the photographer, had used his impossible tool with deliberate purpose, creating a record of persistence rather than destruction. Another photo showed children playing in a yard behind a house on a residential street, their toys scattered across grass that needed mowing, a scene of casual summer afternoon. The house itself was unremarkable, a small ranch-style home common throughout Tennessee, but the finder recognized the address from property records she'd been studying. The house had been built in 1968, 15 years after the photograph was supposedly taken, on a lot that had been empty farmland during the 50s. Yet here it stood in the image, complete with mature trees in the yard that would have taken decades to grow, children playing who wouldn't be born until the 80s. One of those children, now a middle-aged man running an insurance agency downtown, confirmed the photo showed his childhood home and identified himself in the frame. He remembered that specific afternoon because his sister had fallen and scraped her knee, an event visible in the photo as she sat crying while he stood nearby looking concerned. The penultimate photograph on the roll showed Main Street at night, streetlights creating pools of yellow illumination, stores closed and sidewalks empty under a clear dark sky. At first it seemed like the least interesting image in the collection, just a quiet small-town evening with nothing particular to distinguish it from countless similar nights. But closer examination revealed something unsettling about the quality of light, the way shadows fell, the specific configuration of stars visible in the gap between buildings. An amateur astronomer who examined the image identified the stellar positions as matching a specific date and time, October 15, 2028, at approximately 9:30 p.m. That date was still years in the future from the present moment, meaning this photograph documented an evening that hadn't yet occurred, a future still waiting to unfold. The finder stared at the image for hours, wondering if she was looking at an inevitable future or merely one possibility among many, a moment that might or might not actually arrive. The final photograph showed the hardware store itself, the building where the camera had been found, but the image was different from all the others. Instead of showing the store at some point in the future, it appeared to show the basement at the moment of the camera's discovery, the exact scene when the finder first opened that leather case. She could see herself in the frame, her hand reaching toward the camera, her expression a mixture of curiosity and puzzlement, captured from an angle that suggested the photographer stood where she had been standing. The impossible recursion made her head hurt. The idea that the camera had somehow photographed its own discovery decades before that discovery occurred, creating a loop of observation. In the background of the image, barely visible in shadow, stood a figure that she didn't remember being present, a man in outdated clothing watching from the basement stairs. She enlarged the image as much as possible and felt her breath catch when she recognized the hardware store owner from old photographs, present at the moment of discovery, somehow observing from across the decades. Subscribe to the channel, because some mysteries lead to places stranger than anywhere mapped, and you need to see where this goes. The finder contacted everyone who had been involved in examining the photographs, sharing the final image, and asking if anyone could explain the presence of the previous owner. None of them had rational explanations, though several pointed out that if the camera could photograph the future, perhaps it could also create closed loops where observer and observed collapsed into paradox. The physicist suggested the figure might be an artifact of the developing process, a shadow that looked like a person when examined with enough imagination and desire for meaning. But the finder knew what she'd seen, and knew that the figure's posture, the way he stood watching, carried an intentionality that random chemical processes couldn't create. She began to wonder if the hardware store owner had somehow known the camera would be found, had positioned himself in time to witness that discovery, closing a circle that began when he first looked through the viewfinder. The implications were staggering, suggesting that cause and effect might be far more fluid and interpenetrating than anyone had imagined, that future discoveries might reach back to shape the past that produced them. She returned to the hardware store basement one evening after closing, standing in the exact spot where she'd found the camera, trying to feel any residual presence or anomaly. The space was ordinary, concrete floor and brick walls, nothing to distinguish it from thousands of similar basements in small-town commercial buildings across America. Yet something had happened here, some intersection of place and time and consciousness that allowed a simple camera to become a window into years that hadn't yet unfolded. She thought about all the moments captured on that roll of film, the graduations and festivals and quiet streets, all documented before they existed as anything more than potential. The camera sat in her apartment now, locked in a drawer, and she'd thought many times about loading it with new film to see if the effect would repeat. But something held her back. A sense that some knowledge came with costs that couldn't be calculated until after it was too late to choose differently. Local interest in the photographs gradually faded as no new information emerged, and researchers exhausted their analytical approaches without reaching satisfying conclusions. The images were filed away in archives, noted in academic papers about temporal anomalies and unexplained phenomena, but generated no breakthrough understanding of how or why. The finder kept copies of everything, the photos pinned to a corkboard in her study, a reminder that the world contained mysteries that resisted solution through conventional investigation. She noticed that people who'd seen the images tended to become more thoughtful about time, more aware of how past and future might interpenetrate in ways usually invisible. Several mentioned having dreams where they saw their own futures, though whether this was genuine precognition or just the power of suggestion, no one could definitively say. The camera itself sat unused, its impossible potential locked away, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to look through its viewfinder and see what time might reveal. Years passed, and the finder grew older, the mystery no closer to resolution, but no less fascinating for its resistance to explanation and rational analysis. She sometimes wondered if the hardware store owner had also grown old with his secret, watching the town change and knowing he'd already seen these transformations in his basement decades earlier. Had he experienced déjà vu constantly, Or had the human mind's capacity for forgetting protected him from the burden of perpetual recognition and foreknowledge? She imagined him standing on Main Street in the 70s, watching cars that he'd photographed in the 50s pass by, confirming that his impossible visions were becoming present reality. The weight of such knowledge seemed unbearable, and she understood better why he'd hidden the camera away, choosing to let the future arrive in its own time without constant reminder. There was wisdom in that decision, a recognition that some capacities, even when genuine and accessible, should perhaps remain dormant for the sake of sanity and peace. The town continued its slow evolution, buildings being renovated or replaced, generations turning over, the names on mailboxes changing as families moved in and out. The finder found herself watching these changes with heightened awareness, wondering if somewhere there existed photographs of Kingsport 50 years hence, moments already captured, but not yet lived. She thought about the photo showing Main Street in 2028, that future evening still approaching, and wondered if she would live to see it match the image. Part of her wanted to be standing on that exact spot when the moment arrived, to confirm that the camera had truly shown an inevitable future rather than one possible timeline among infinite alternatives. But another part feared such confirmation, worried that certainty about predetermined futures might collapse all the uncertainty that made life bearable and choices meaningful. The tension between wanting to know and fearing knowledge defined her relationship with the mystery, a contradiction she'd learned to accept without resolving. One afternoon, she was contacted by a man who'd read about the photographs online and claimed to have information relevant to understanding their origin and meaning. He was elderly, in his 80s, and said he'd known the hardware store owner slightly, remembered him as quiet and intensely private, someone who kept to himself even in a small town where everyone knew everyone. The man recalled one conversation from the late 50s, shortly before the hardware store owner stopped participating in community events and retreated into near total isolation. They'd been discussing the future, wondering what changes the next decades might bring, and the owner had said something strange that stuck in memory across the intervening years. He'd said that the future wasn't coming toward them, but rather they were falling into it, and that sometimes if you looked carefully, you could see where you'd land before arriving. The comment had seemed like philosophical musing at the time, but in light of the photographs it took on the quality of confession, an oblique admission of having seen what most couldn't. The finder asked if the hardware store owner had ever mentioned photography or cameras, and the elderly man thought carefully before responding. He recalled seeing him once with a camera, unusual because the owner generally avoided being photographed and seemed to have no interest in documenting events or people. This was in the autumn of '53, October if memory served, a clear afternoon with good light, the owner standing on Main Street apparently taking pictures of nothing in particular. When asked what he was photographing, the owner had simply smiled and said he was trying to see if the camera worked the way he thought it might. The comment had seemed innocuous then, just someone testing equipment, but combined with everything else, it suggested a man conducting experiments with implications he couldn't fully share. The elderly man said that after that autumn, the owner seemed different, more withdrawn, carrying himself like someone burdened by knowledge they couldn't set down or give away. The finder thanked him for sharing these memories and sat alone afterward, thinking about a man standing on Main Street 70 years ago, photographing futures he alone could see. She imagined the moment when he first looked at the developed pictures and realized what he was seeing, the mixture of wonder and horror that must have accompanied such revelation. Did he try to warn people about what was coming? Or did he understand immediately that no one would believe him, that proof wouldn't overcome the fundamental impossibility of his claim? Perhaps he'd considered publishing the photographs, making them public, but realized that even perfect evidence might be dismissed as elaborate forgery by minds unable to accommodate such radical revision of temporal mechanics. So he'd hidden the camera and lived with what he knew, watching the future gradually become present, his impossible photographs slowly transforming from prediction into record. The loneliness of such knowledge seemed crushing, and she felt profound sympathy for a man who'd carried such burden alone, until death released him from the obligation of knowing what others couldn't. She decided to write everything down, to create a complete record of the camera's discovery and the photographs it contained, not as proof, but as testimony. The document would be deposited with local historical societies, archived where it might be found by future researchers who might have better tools or frameworks for understanding temporal anomalies. She included copies of all the photographs, chemical analysis results, testimony from everyone who'd examined the evidence and offered their perspectives on what it might mean. The final section of the document was her own reflection on what the experience had taught her about time, consciousness, and the limits of human understanding. She wrote that some mysteries might not have solutions in the conventional sense, but rather represented invitations to expand our conception of what reality could contain. The camera had shown that the future existed in some form accessible to observation, but what that meant for free will, causality, and human agency remained profoundly uncertain. But the truth comes now, in what the camera revealed about the nature of time and our place within its flow. The finder kept the camera locked away for years, never loading it with new film, treating it more as sacred relic than functional tool for observation. But on the 70th anniversary of the date stamped on those original photographs, October 15, 2023, she made a decision that surprised even herself. She purchased film stock that was as close as possible to what would have been available in the 1950s, found a developer who could process it using period techniques. Then she loaded the camera, walked to Main Street, and began taking photographs of ordinary moments. People walking dogs, cars passing, the courthouse clock showing the afternoon hour. She felt foolish doing it, aware that she probably looked like an eccentric old woman playing with antique equipment, but something compelled her to complete the experiment. When the film was developed 2 weeks later, she opened the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, uncertain what she hoped or feared to see. The photographs showed exactly what she'd pointed the camera at: contemporary Kingsport, current cars, modern street fixtures, the present captured as present without temporal displacement. There was nothing unusual about the images, no glimpses of the future, no impossible juxtapositions of time, just straightforward documentary photography using outdated equipment. She felt simultaneously relieved and disappointed, grateful that the burden of precognition hadn't passed to her, but sad that the camera's strange gift appeared to have been one-time occurrence. Perhaps the hardware store owner had been unique in some way that allowed him to access the camera's potential, or perhaps the window between times had closed permanently. She put the new photographs away with the old ones, the ordinary beside the impossible, a reminder that magic, when it occurs, might not repeat on demand. The camera went back into its drawer, and she felt the last thread of hope that she might understand the mystery finally break and fall away. Then 3 days later she received an envelope in the mail with no return address, postmarked from Kingsport, but otherwise anonymous and unexplained. Inside were 3 photographs, clearly taken with a Kodak Brownie based on the image quality and aspect ratio, showing her standing on Main Street taking pictures. The photographs showed her from angles she knew no one else had occupied during her experimental photo session, perspectives that would have required standing in the middle of traffic. More unsettling, they showed her at 3 different moments during that afternoon. Exact sequences she remembered but hadn't realized anyone was documenting. Impossible surveillance. On the back of each photo, in handwriting that trembled with age, was written a single word: continues. She felt the ground shift beneath her certainty that the camera's strange properties had been singular event, realized that the mystery was still unfolding in ways she couldn't predict. She examined the photographs under magnification, searching for any clue about who had taken them or what they might mean beyond their immediate evidence. In the background of one image, barely visible in the shadow of a doorway, stood a figure that might have been a person or might have been a trick of light and darkness. She couldn't be certain, but something about the figure's posture reminded her of the man she'd seen in that final photograph from the original roll, the hardware store owner watching across time. The idea that he might still be present in some form, still observing through decades, should have terrified her, but instead brought strange comfort, a sense of not being alone in the mystery. If the camera could photograph the future, perhaps it could also create bridges between past and present, allow consciousness to persist beyond the normal boundaries of life and death. She had no framework for such ideas, no language adequate to the experience, but felt certain that whatever was happening involved more than simple temporal displacement of images. She decided to reach out to researchers again, to share the new development and see if anyone could offer fresh insights based on this evidence of ongoing anomalous activity. Most were skeptical, suggesting the photographs of her might be elaborate pranks by someone who knew about the original mystery and wanted to create artificial continuation. But chemical analysis of the film stock showed it was genuinely from the 1950s, impossible to obtain now, except from private collections or carefully preserved stock. The developer confirmed the images had been processed using old techniques, the chemical signatures matching what would have been standard practice 70 years earlier, nothing modern or synthetic. Once again, the evidence pointed toward something impossible that refused to be explained away through skepticism or appeals to conventional fabrication methods. The finder began to accept that she'd become part of a story larger than her individual experience, woven into temporal patterns beyond any single human's capacity to observe or understand completely. She started paying closer attention to moments that felt somehow significant, times when the present seemed pregnant with meaning that exceeded its obvious content. Sometimes she would be walking downtown and feel a subtle shift, as if she were being observed by someone not quite present in the conventional sense. These moments never lasted long, just a few seconds of heightened awareness before normal perception returned, but they left her feeling connected to something vast and strange. She wondered if the hardware store owner had experienced similar sensations, a perpetual awareness of being seen by future or past selves, observing through the camera's impossible lens. The thought made her feel less alone in her confusion and uncertainty, part of a chain of witnesses to something that transcended ordinary categories of experience. She began to think of the mystery not as a problem to be solved, but as an ongoing relationship with time itself, a conversation conducted through photographs and presence. Years continued to pass, and the finder grew accustomed to living with unresolved mystery as a permanent companion rather than temporary puzzle awaiting solution. She kept the camera in a place of honor in her home, no longer hidden in a drawer, but displayed where she could see it daily and remember what it represented. Occasionally, she would receive anonymous envelopes containing photographs, always showing moments from her life taken with what appeared to be the same or similar camera, impossible documentation. Some showed events from her past that no one could have photographed because they occurred in private moments. Yet here they were, captured with perfect clarity. Others showed her in situations she didn't yet recognize, future moments still approaching, evidence that the camera's strange gift continued to operate according to its own mysterious logic. She kept all of them in an album, a visual autobiography created by unknown observer across time. Her life documented by someone or something that existed outside normal temporal sequence. The town changed around her, new buildings replacing old familiar faces disappearing as people died or moved away, the slow renovation of place that defines small communities. She watched these changes with the knowledge that somewhere they might already be photographed, documented before they occurred by a camera that saw futures as present moments. The idea no longer disturbed her as it once had, but instead brought a strange peace, a sense that change was both real and somehow already complete, tension between becoming and being resolved in temporal patterns beyond usual comprehension. She thought often about the hardware store owner, felt kinship with him across the decades, two people connected by having seen what others couldn't and having to live with that knowledge. Sometimes she would visit his grave in the cemetery and tell him what she'd discovered, speaking aloud as if he might somehow hear through whatever dimension separated past from present. She liked to imagine that he did hear, that consciousness persisted in forms that allowed for such communication, that the mystery was ultimately about connection rather than isolation. On October 15, 2028, she went to Main Street at exactly 9:30 p.m., determined to see if the night would match the photograph taken 75 years earlier. The streetlights cast yellow pools exactly as shown in the image, and the stars visible between buildings matched the configuration the astronomer had identified. Everything perfectly aligned. She stood on the empty sidewalk, the stores closed around her, feeling the weight of temporal convergence, past prediction becoming present confirmation in a moment of perfect correspondence. The camera had been right. The future it photographed had arrived exactly as documented, proof that at least one timeline was fixed rather than fluid, determined rather than indeterminate. She felt tears on her face, though she couldn't have said whether from wonder or grief or some mixture of emotions that had no simple name. In that moment, she understood that the mystery would never be solved, because it wasn't a puzzle, but a door, an opening into ways of experiencing time that most people never imagined possible. She remained on Main Street for an hour, watching the night deepen, feeling the presence of past and future converging in the eternal present moment. A car passed occasionally, its headlights sweeping across pavement, sound of the engine fading into distance until silence returned and settled like snow. She thought about all the moments captured on those impossible photographs, all the lives documented before they were lived, the strangeness of knowing without understanding. The mystery of the camera had given her something precious despite its resistance to explanation, an expanded sense of what reality might contain, how consciousness and time might interpenetrate. She had become a guardian of the impossible, keeping evidence safe for whoever might eventually develop frameworks sufficient to decode what the photographs meant beyond their immediate impossibility. And in that role, she found purpose that transcended any need for answers, satisfaction in witnessing rather than explaining, in preserving rather than solving. The last photograph she ever received arrived on her 85th birthday, showing her standing in a garden she didn't recognize, surrounded by flowers in full bloom. Behind her in the image stood several people, their faces unclear, but their postures suggesting affection and care, family perhaps, or friends gathered for celebration. She studied the photograph for hours, wondering if it showed a future she would actually experience or simply a possibility among many. Hope, rather than prediction. The ambiguity didn't trouble her anymore. She'd learned to live with uncertainty as a companion rather than enemy, mystery as friend rather than problem requiring immediate resolution. She placed the photograph in her album next to all the others, a visual record of a life observed across time by something that saw her more completely than she could see herself. And she thought, not for the first time, that perhaps being seen was what mattered most. That consciousness existed not in isolation but in the act of witnessing and being witnessed across all possible dimensions of time and space. The camera sits now in a museum in Kingsport, displayed behind glass with a placard explaining its strange history, and the photographs it produced defying temporal logic. Visitors read the story and look at the images, some skeptical, others intrigued, a few profoundly moved by the evidence of something beyond ordinary understanding. The finder's extensive documentation accompanies the exhibit, her careful record of discovery and investigation, preserved for whoever might continue the work she began. She died peacefully at 87, her last words reportedly about seeing clearly for the first time, though what she saw she left unspecified. Among her possessions was the camera's original leather case, and inside it a note in her handwriting that simply said, "The future is always now, and the past is still becoming." No one knows quite what she meant, but the words seem appropriate somehow. A final mystery from a woman who lived inside impossible temporal loops without losing her essential humanity or hope. The photographs themselves remain, archived and preserved, evidence that something strange occurred in Kingsport, though the mechanism and meaning resist final explanation. Researchers occasionally examine them, bringing new technologies and theories to bear, but none have yet explained how analog film could capture moments that hadn't occurred. Some suggest quantum effects, others propose that consciousness itself might operate outside normal temporal constraints under specific conditions, creating observational loops. The truth, if such a word applies, remains elusive, and perhaps ultimately inaccessible to minds trained to think of time as linear progression rather than interpenetrating dimensions. But the camera stands as testament to the fact that the world contains more mystery than any philosophy or science has yet encompassed, more strangeness than reason can fully map. And perhaps that's the real gift of the discovery. Not explanation but wonder, not answers but expanded awareness of how little anyone truly understands about the nature of existence itself. The hardware store building still stands on Main Street, converted now into apartments. The basement where the camera was found divided into storage units for tenants. No other mysterious objects have been discovered there, though people sometimes report odd feelings in certain corners, momentary sensations of being watched by no one visible. The new residents know nothing about the camera or its impossible photographs, going about their lives unaware that their home was once the site of temporal breach. Perhaps that's fitting, the way extraordinary events fade into ordinary history, miraculous discoveries becoming footnotes that most people never encounter or consider. But for those who know the story, who've seen the photographs and struggled with their implications, Kingsport remains forever marked by what occurred there. The town became a place where time proved more fluid than anyone expected, where past and future showed themselves capable of intersection through mechanisms that defy conventional understanding completely. Late at night, when Main Street lies empty under streetlights and the stars wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, something lingers in the air of Kingsport. It might be just the wind moving through the valley, or the distant sound of traffic on the highway, or the settling of old buildings into earth. But those who've experienced the mystery recognize it as something else, the presence of time itself, conscious and aware, observing its own flow through mortal eyes. The camera was never just a tool, but a window, and what looked through it might have been looking back at itself, past seeing future, and future seeing past in eternal recursive loop. Whether this represents something about the nature of consciousness or merely an isolated anomaly in one Tennessee town, no one can say with certainty or final authority. But the photographs endure, impossible and real, testament to the fact that the universe preserves more secrets than humanity has yet imagined, and that small towns sometimes harbor mysteries as deep as any ocean or as vast as any galaxy in the endless night above. The greatest mystery was never how the camera worked, but why it existed at all. What purpose was served by allowing one man to see across decades into moments not yet born? Perhaps there is no purpose, just random emergence of extraordinary capacity from ordinary matter, under circumstances that may never be repeated or understood. Or perhaps the camera was gift, invitation to recognize that time is not the prison it appears, but rather a landscape through which consciousness might move in ways normally invisible. The hardware store owner took his understanding to the grave, if understanding is even the right word for what he experienced during those strange autumn days in '53. But he left behind evidence, breadcrumbs for those who followed, proof that the world contained more possibility than everyday experience suggested, or science had yet mapped. And in that evidence, he gave future generations a choice, to dismiss the impossible or to let it expand their conception of what reality might actually be, when seen without the filters of expectation and conventional belief. The finder would have said near the end of her life that the camera taught her to see differently, to recognize that every moment contains past and future simultaneously. She learned to watch the present with awareness that it was already history to some future observer, while remaining unknown territory to consciousness trapped in sequential progression. This double vision became her constant companion, a way of experiencing time that few achieve, but that might be available to anyone willing to abandon certainty for mystery. She would have said that the photographs were never about prediction or proof, but about presence, about learning to be fully alive in moments that intersect all possible times. And she would have encouraged anyone who learned her story to seek their own temporal mysteries, to watch for moments when past and future show themselves more clearly than usual, because the camera in Kingsport might have been unique, but the capacity to see beyond normal temporal constraints might be more common than anyone imagines, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. Some mysteries never end when the truth is found. They simply transform into deeper questions that lead into territories where language fails and only wonder remains. So subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story we uncover from the forgotten corners of America.